Snow fell softly that Christmas Eve, blanketing the quiet neighborhood in a hushed stillness. Streetlights flickered, casting pale golden pools on the empty sidewalk, where only the wind seemed to wander. Inside a modest, time-worn house at the edge of Maple Street, Arthur Hayes leaned back in his old armchair, its fabric worn and familiar beneath him. His eyes, grey and clouded with age, lingered on the window, watching the world grow colder and darker. The only light in the room came from the flickering glow of a small Christmas tree, its ornaments dull and tired. Much like the man himself, Arthur's hands, speckled with liver spots and marked by years of work, turned a faded photograph over and over. In it, a younger version of him smiled, arms wrapped around a woman with bright eyes, and laughter that seemed to echo even now. Beside them, a little girl grinned, her front teeth missing, clutching a teddy bear with one arm and her father's leg with the other. That Christmas, so many years ago, felt like a lifetime from where he sat now, alone, the silence pressing in like a cold draft that no fire could warm. He glanced at the clock on the mantel, its hands inching closer to midnight with a weary patience. Outside, a gust rattled the window panes, and Arthur sighed, his breath unsteady. It had been nearly a decade since Linda passed, and almost 5 since his daughter moved across the country, her calls becoming fewer with each year. Holidays came and went, marked only by cards left unopened on the kitchen table, and voicemails he couldn't bear to delete. He wasn't sure which was worse, being forgotten or pretending not to notice. The kettle whistled from the kitchen, sharp and sudden. Arthur pushed himself up, joints stiff with age, and shuffled to pour a cup of tea, the simple routine a balm for the loneliness. As he stirred in honey, his mind wandered, replaying Christmases past, laughter ringing through the house, the smell of pine and cinnamon, tiny hands tugging at wrapping paper with eager delight, the kind of warmth that stayed long after the snow melted. A knock shattered the quiet, abrupt and out of place. Arthur froze, spoon halfway to the sink, heart stuttering with a mix of confusion and something else, hope maybe, though he quickly brushed it aside. It was probably a mistake, a carol singer lost, or a delivery at the wrong address. But the knock came again, hesitant but insistent, echoing down the narrow hallway. His hands trembled as he set the cup down and made his way to the door, each step slow and uncertain. No one visited anymore, not the neighbors, who had long stopped, inviting him to block parties, and certainly not family. The porch light buzzed faintly as he reached for the handle, hesitating. For a moment, he stared at the door, almost expecting it to be another figment of memory, a ghost of Christmas past. But the cold metal was real under his palm, and as he pulled it open, the night spilled in, sharp and biting. On the other side stood a boy, no older than 10, bundled in a coat too big for his small frame, a woolen hat pulled low over his ears. His cheeks were red from the cold, eyes wide and dark, and in his gloved hands he clutched a wrinkled paper bag. "Hi," the boy mumbled, shifting from foot to foot. I didn't know where else to go." Arthur blinked, words catching in his throat. The boy's gaze flickered to the dimly lit hallway behind him, uncertain but hopeful. For a heartbeat, neither moved, the snow swirling between them in a dance of white and silence. "Are you lost?" Arthur finally managed, his voice rasping from disuse. The boy shook his head quickly, but his eyes glistened with something that looked a lot like fear. "No, I needed somewhere to be." He hesitated, then thrust the paper bag forward, nearly dropping it. "I brought these. Cookies. I thought maybe Maybe you'd like some." Arthur stared at the bag, then at the boy, confusion warring with concern. Strangers didn't just show up on doorsteps with cookies, especially not on Christmas Eve. And yet, beneath the boy's nerves, there was something else. Desperation, perhaps, or a kind of loneliness that Arthur knew all too well. Against all reason, he stepped aside, the words slipping out before he could think better of them. "You'd better come in before you freeze." The boy's shoulders sagged with relief, and he shuffled past, snow melting in damp patches on the doormat. Arthur closed the door, cutting off the chill, though the air between them remained awkward and cool. In the kitchen, the boy peeled off his gloves hesitantly, revealing fingers red and raw from the cold. They sat at the small table, the silence filled only by the tick of the clock and the faint whistle of wind outside. Arthur poured another cup of tea, pushing it toward the boy, who cupped it gratefully, fingers curling around the warmth. Minutes passed, stretching long and uneasy, until Arthur cleared his throat. "So," he ventured, keeping his tone gentle, "what's your name?" But the boy looked away, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup, his lips pressed tight, a shadow passing over his face that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. "It's complicated," he mumbled finally. I really needed somewhere to go tonight." Arthur frowned, concern sharpening. The boy's coat was frayed at the edges, his shoes scuffed and damp. He glanced at the door, half expecting a frantic parent to burst in with apologies and explanations. But the night beyond the window remained dark and empty, the snow falling, heavier now, piling soft and silent on the sill. "You're not in trouble, are you?" Arthur asked, voice soft. The boy flinched, shaking his head too quickly. "No, His breath hitched, fingers tightening around the cup. "I didn't want to be alone." And there it was, the crack in the armor, the same ache that Arthur felt deep in his own bones. He didn't press, just nodded slowly, letting the silence settle once more. Whatever brought the boy here, he could wait for the truth. Sometimes, a warm house and a listening ear were enough to keep the cold at bay. But as Arthur moved to fetch a blanket from the hall closet, his eyes caught on the boy's bag, now half open on the table. Inside, the cookies lay nestled in napkins, but something else glinted beneath them, a folded slip of paper, edges worn and ink smudged. Frowning, Arthur reached for it, fingers brushing the rough paper. But before he could unfold it, the boy's voice came, small and frightened. "Please," he whispered, eyes wide and pleading. "Don't." Arthur hesitated, hand hovering above the note, questions tumbling one after another. But the boy's eyes were glassy, lower lip trembling, and something about the look stopped him cold. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes like a warning, and in the quiet that followed, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that this unexpected visitor was hiding far more than just a name. Arthur's fingers hovered over the crumpled note for a moment longer before he pulled back, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The boy's eyes were wide, dark lashes wet with barely held back tears, and Arthur's chest tightened at the sight. Whatever secrets lay hidden in that slip of paper could wait. Right now, the kid needed warmth more than he needed answers. "It's all right," Arthur murmured, retreating a step to give the boy space. "You're safe here." The boy's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, and he blinked rapidly, swiping a sleeve across his eyes. Arthur turned away, pretending not to notice, and busied himself by refilling the kettle, the clink of cups and the hum of water a quiet reassurance. Minutes stretched, punctuated only by the tick of the wall clock and the soft whistle of wind. Outside, Arthur's gaze flickered to the boy's coat, thin and soaked through at the cuffs. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You must be freezing," he said gently. "There's an old sweater in the hall closet. It's not much, but—" The boy hesitated, eyes darting to the door, but then nodded slowly. As he shrugged out of the damp coat, Arthur saw just how small he really was. Collarbones jutting sharp beneath a faded shirt, wrists pale and scrawny. A pang of worry twisted low in Arthur's gut. He fetched the sweater, a navy blue one Linda had knitted years ago, the wool soft and comforting. The boy's fingers fumbled a bit as he pulled it on, sleeves drooping past his hands. But for the first time, a faint smile ghosted across his face. "Thanks," he mumbled, voice muffled. Arthur offered a small smile in return, though concern shadowed his eyes. No trouble. They settled back at the kitchen table, steam curling from the tea between them. Arthur hesitated, searching for the right words, gentle enough not to scare him off, but firm enough to get to the truth. "You live around here?" he asked casually, blowing at his cup. The boy's eyes dropped to the table, fingers picking at a loose thread on the sweater's cuff. "Kind of," he muttered. "Not really." "Not really," Arthur echoed, arching a brow. A pause. Then the boy shrugged, a little too quickly. "We move a lot." Arthur's frown deepened. "We?" "My mom and me," the boy said, the words coming out fast, almost rehearsed, but something flickered in his gaze. Too quick, too painful. She's working late tonight." Arthur's fingers tightened around his cup. It wasn't much, but he could recognize a lie when he heard one. He'd told enough himself, over the years, half-truths to neighbors about being just fine, bright smiles to his daughter over the phone while his heart ached with loneliness. But he let it go, for now. The kid was here, and that was enough reason to worry. They talked in bits and pieces, Arthur asking simple questions, the boy dodging most of them, eyes flickering to the door every so often. But between the pauses and the small sips of tea, Arthur learned that the boy's name was Sam, that he liked soccer and comic books and oatmeal cookies without raisins, that his mom worked a lot and that he hated the snow. It wasn't much, but it was something. The hours wore on, the clock hands sliding closer to midnight. Arthur's eyes felt heavy, and he caught Sam stifling a yawn behind his sleeve, lids drooping. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows hard enough to make Arthur flinch. He glanced out at the dark street, snow piling fast and thick, and knew there was no way he was sending the boy back out into that. "The sofa." "Pulls out," Arthur offered gruffly, clearing his throat. "It's not much, but—" Sam's head snapped up, eyes wide and startled. For a second, he seemed ready to bolt, fingers clutching the edge of the table. But then the tension ebbed, and he nodded, voice small and grateful. "Thanks," he whispered. Arthur moved to fetch blankets from the hall closet, pulling out faded quilts and a spare pillow. But as he unfolded the couch, laying out sheets with shaky hands, his mind churned with questions. Where Sam had really come from, why he was out alone on Christmas Eve, and what secrets hid beneath that crumpled note. He wanted to press, to demand answers, but the kid's face was pale and drawn, eyes ringed with shadows. Whatever the truth was, it could wait until morning. But sleep didn't come easier. Arthur lay awake in his own bed, the ceiling cracked and familiar above him, the silence thick with unanswered questions. Down the hall, he could hear Sam shifting, restlessly, the couch springs creaking under his slight weight. Arthur stared at the dark until his eyes burned. each creak and groan sharpening the unease twisting in his gut. Sometime past midnight, Arthur startled awake to the sound of muffled sobs. For a moment, he lay still, heart pounding, the darkness too heavy. Then he swung his legs over the side of the bed, knees protesting, and moved into the hall, feet soft, on the worn carpet. In the living room, Sam sat huddled on the edge of the pull-out, knees drawn to his chest, shoulders shaking with silent cries. His hands clutched the crumpled note to his chest, fingers white with tension. The sight stopped Arthur cold, small and alone, a shadow in the dark, eyes squeezed shut as if to block out the world. Arthur hesitated, guilt twisting deep. He should go back, give the boy space, pretend he hadn't seen. But the broken look on Sam's face held him rooted, heart aching with the rawness of it. Carefully, he stepped forward, lowering himself into the armchair beside the sofa with a groan of tired bones. Sam flinched, knuckles going white around the paper, eyes wide and terrified. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching heavy and uncertain. But then Arthur reached out, slow and careful, a hand hovering just above the boy's shoulder. "It's all right," he said, voice low and rough. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Sam's lip trembled, eyes shimmering in the dim light, his fingers loosened, just a fraction, and the crumpled note slipped from his grasp, landing softly on the blanket. Arthur's gaze dropped to it, breath catching as the faint writing came into view. Shaky, hurried letters scrawled in blue ink, the edges smudged. 2 words stood out, sharp and clear. "Help me." His blood ran cold, heart stuttering painfully in his chest. But before he could speak, before he could even process the words, Sam's voice came, small and broken. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered, eyes glistening. I think someone's after me." And in that moment, with the storm howling outside and shadows creeping long into the room, Arthur knew that this Christmas Eve was only the beginning. Arthur's breath caught in his throat, eyes fixed on the crumpled note with its desperate scrawl, 2 words that seemed to pulse in the quiet. "Help me." Sam's eyes were wide and terrified. His fingers twisted in the blanket, like he might bolt at any second. Arthur swallowed hard, forcing the panic rising in his chest back down. He'd faced worse than this in his years. Nights in hospital waiting rooms, funerals, empty mailboxes. But nothing had ever cut quite this deep. "Easy now," Arthur murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "Just tell me what's going on." Sam hesitated, lip trembling, eyes flicking to the window where snow smudged the glass. For a moment, Arthur thought he wouldn't answer, but then the boy's shoulders sagged, all the fight draining out of him at once. "It's my stepdad," Sam whispered, voice raw. He gets angry sometimes. And Mom, his breath hitched, hands curling into fists. She tries to stop him, but Arthur's jaw clenched, rage sparking low in his gut. He'd seen it before. Neighbors who flinched at loud voices, kids with bruises they couldn't explain. He'd been too late to help them then, too caught up in his own grief. But he was here now, and Sam was looking at him with eyes that pleaded for something, anything, to make it better. Without thinking, Arthur reached out, laying a hand over the boy's fists. Rough fingers warm and steady. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you." Sam's eyes shimmered, the barest flicker of relief breaking through the fear. For the first time that night, he leaned forward, just enough for his forehead, to brush Arthur's sleeve, the small weight of it enough to make Arthur's chest ache. They stayed like that for a moment, the storm rattling the windows, and shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Arthur's mind raced. Police, shelters, anything that might keep Sam safe. But the nearest station was miles out, and the phone lines had gone down hours ago with the wind. Then, a new sound cut through the silence. The crunch of tires on snow, slow and deliberate. Arthur stiffened, eyes snapping to the window where headlights swept across the walls, bright and harsh. Sam flinched, curling in on himself, and Arthur's blood ran cold. "It's him!" The boy choked, voice thin with terror. "Please, we have to hide." Arthur was already moving, heart pounding painfully in his ears. He grabbed Sam's hand, pulling him to his feet and toward the hallway. Old bones protesting with every step. The headlights bobbed closer, beams sliding through the living room like searchlights, and Arthur's pulse thundered in time with the footsteps crunching up the porch steps. He pushed Sam into the hall closet, pressing a finger to his lips. "Stay here," he whispered, voice fierce and low. "No matter what." Sam's eyes glistened, but he nodded, small hands clutching Arthur's sleeve for a moment. Before letting go, the door clicked shut, darkness swallowing him, and Arthur forced himself to turn away, legs shaking with each step, back to the living room. The knock came, hard and heavy, rattling the door on its hinges. Arthur's hands trembled, but he gripped the knob tight, pulling it open just enough to peer out. A man loomed on the porch, broad-shouldered and unshaven, eyes flat and mean, beneath the brim of a damp cap. His jacket was patched and streaked with mud, boots scuffing the doormat as he leaned in, breath fogging in the chill. "Evenin'," the man drawled, voice slurred with drink. "Lookin' for my boy." His eyes flicked past Arthur, narrowing at the faint light pooling from the hallway. Arthur's spine stiffened, grip tightening on the door. "No one here but me," he lied, voice steady, despite the icy fear coiling in his gut. The man's mouth twisted, a sneer pulling at his lip. "That's so," he grunted, shoving forward until Arthur had to brace a hand against the doorframe to keep him out. "Saw him running this way. Best not lie to me, old man." Rage flared, sudden and blinding. Arthur squared his shoulders, planting himself firm between the man and the hallway. "I think you better leave," he said coldly, every word a challenge. For a heartbeat, neither moved, breath misting in the freezing air. Then, with a snarl, the man's fist shot out, catching Arthur square in the chest and sending him stumbling back, pain flaring hot and sharp. The door crashed open, the wind howling in behind it. But Arthur didn't fall. He gripped the door frame, teeth grit against the pane, and swung with all the force left in his weary bones, catching the man across the jaw. The surprise in those dark eyes was almost satisfying. Even as Arthur's knuckles screamed in protest, the struggle was clumsy, desperate. Fists and curses and cold searing through every crack in the walls. But then a siren wailed in the distance, red and blue lights streaking through the snow. The man froze, eyes darting wide and wild. He staggered back, cursing under his breath, and bolted into the night, tires skidding and fishtailing down the icy street. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Arthur's ragged breaths and the distant wail of sirens growing closer. His knees buckled, and he caught himself on the arm of the sofa, every inch of him aching. Then the closet door creaked open, and Sam stumbled out, eyes wide and wet. Without a word, he rushed forward, arms wrapping tight around Arthur's waist, face buried in his chest. Arthur's arms came up slowly, folding around the boy with a gentleness that made his heart ache. He smoothed a hand over Sam's back, voice trembling, but warm. "It's all right," he whispered, eyes burning. "You're safe now." And as the police lights spilled bright and blinding across the porch, Arthur held on tighter, the warmth of that small, shivering body enough to melt the chill that had settled in his bones for years. That night, as dawn crept pale and hesitant over the snow, Arthur sat with Sam, curled at his side, a blanket draped over both of them. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt less empty, filled instead with soft breaths and the steady beat of two hearts, no longer alone. Christmas morning came with golden light and soft snow, and though the wounds would take time to heal, for now it was enough just to have someone to hold on to.